Hello Internet, Taliesin here, and today we are talking... Well, okay, here's the thing. We should really be talking about class guides by now, but Blizzard keeps changing stuff and I'm a bit restless, and instead I wanted to take a moment to chat about something just for fun. You know, like memes or the speed limit. So today, Internet, we are going to talk factions. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, factions? That's easy. You've got your Horde and Alliance, red versus blue, Khadgar versus keep your feet on the ground, morally grey versus beautiful angel face crying boy angel who's weirdly even more beautiful when he cries. I think it's fair to say that after 14 years, I've got the factions pretty much down, thank you. And you may well be right, but what if you were wrong? Because there's been a speculative theory doing the rounds for years now. A theory that until now I'd always dismissed as no more than wishful thinking. That until now I'd written off as fan fiction. That until now I had poo-pooed as completely unworkable and totally pointless. That until now I would certainly never have thought worthy of making a video about. And that theory is this. Could there soon be a third playable faction in World of Warcraft? And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, screw you, Taliesin, you clickbait bastard. What kind of a stupid idea is that? This entire game is based on the battle between Horde and Alliance. Shit, this new expansion, Battle for Azeroth, is especially based on that conflict. And you're right, you're absolutely correct. But for me, it's precisely because of how important the faction conflict is in Battle for Azeroth. It's exactly because they are doubling down on Horde versus Alliance narrative so hard that for the very first time, I'm willing to at least listen to and entertain the idea that a third faction could be possible. And I will explain it all to you in the course of this video. We will look at why there could end up needing to be a third faction, how it would work, and what form it might take. So join us for this special Taliesin as we ask if 3 really is the magic number for World of Warcraft going forward. Okay? Go, 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 go. The reasons why Blizz wouldn't introduce a third faction are big, obvious, and furthermore make perfect sense. For one, the entire Warcraft universe and fantasy, right from its very inception, is built around having two sides fighting each other, and being able to take control of either of those sides in the conflict. And this lack of a clear goodie or baddie out of the Alliance and Horde is undoubtedly one of the elements that has attracted players to the game over the years. Both sides have sympathetic and impressive characters with honest motivations. Both sides have their bad apples. Both factions will put aside their differences to stand up to a bigger threat when it's necessary. And seriously, look at the shit that Blizzard get when, from a story point of view, there is even the slightest perceived bias towards one faction or the other. Do they honestly want to invite even more inevitable shit by giving themselves a third group to balance out? And the two-faction system is the bedrock of not just the narrative, but gameplay mechanics too. World of Warcraft is built from the ground up around the idea of a player picking one of two sides and sticking to it. You can't communicate with the opposing faction. You can't sell them your herbs on the auction house. You can't group up with them. You can't enter their cities unless you plan on causing some serious shit. And if you play on a PvP server, well, it's unlikely that you can even be in the same space as them for too long before your numbers are halved. And not only that, but all of the early leveling zones are either Horde or Alliance. Where would a new faction even fit in? How would they level in the first place? Clearly, there is no third faction during the events of Burning Crusade, or Wrath, or Mists, or Legion content, so how would it make sense for a player in a third faction to level through that stuff? And probably the most delicate question of all, and I hate bringing this up, but it is a thing, are there enough players to populate a third faction? Legion was a healthy shot in the arm for the game, and numbers-wise in the MMO scene, WoW is still the only game in town, but can we really afford to split the player base into 3? There's an argument that even having 2 factions is damaging in this respect, so enforcing a further separation is totally contrary to Blizzard's aim of encouraging sociability and team play within the game. I think we can all agree that these are pretty concrete reasons against a third faction, really, aren't they? I mean, you can't argue with that logic, can you? So let's argue with it. Firstly, we're going to look at this from a narrative point of view, because I think that's probably the easiest place to start. why on earth would Blizzard even want to create a new faction in the first place? Given all the sound arguments that we've just heard as to what an unnecessary ball ache it would be, why would they give themselves that headache? Well, because they might have to. Here's the thing about Battle for Azeroth. More than any other expansion before, Blizzard is selling this on being all about the faction war. This is Horde versus Alliance writ large. All the marketing and promotion is based around choosing your side. All the new gameplay features are based around recruiting new allies into your numbers and defeating the opposing faction in various different ways. This is the Horde versus Alliance expansion. Now, there is a caveat to that, of course. Most of the players don't expect this to be the case throughout the entire course of the expansion. For most players, it's a case of, yeah, sure, Blizz, I'll get the Zandalari on side, I'll do war fronts and war mode, I'll follow the ambitiously nuanced story and the new ways you're trying to tell it in game, and all this is great, but come on, we're going to team up and fight the old gods, aren't we? I mean, yeah, Sylvanas, morally grey, Anduin, crying angel face, crying boy, I get it, I do, but the old gods though, and saving the Azeroth world soul from corruption, that's what it's really all about, isn't it? We know it, you know it, and I think we all know that eventually we're going to have to stop fighting each other and start fighting some big fleshy tentacle thing. And that's a pretty fair assumption really, because that's how WoW has always kind of worked. When you have a two-faction system, you can never let one faction actually win, because then you don't have a two-faction system anymore, do you? And the best way to avoid that kind of resolution is to have those constant threats that require the faction war to become secondary to whatever the real danger is, which is where we have a problem with BFA, because as we've said, no other expansion has ever been sold so hard, so completely on the idea of the faction war before. The closest was probably Mists of Pandaria, but even then, players knew before they began that they would be taking on Garrosh Hellscream as the final big bad. With BFA, Horde versus Alliance really is all they've got. It is, I guess, the ultimate Horde versus Alliance expansion. And when it's being made out to be that important, when you're asking your players to engage that strongly into an idea, you need some kind of resolution, because otherwise those players are going to feel a bit shortchanged. Legion was sold as the ultimate battle with the Burning Legion, and part of the fun of that expansion was how big the invasion felt, how important everything that happened was. If the expansion had finished without that clear, decisive defeat of the Legion and of Sargeras, then it would have weakened everything we did in retrospect, and it would have pissed everyone off. In Wrath of the Lich King, it was all about Arthas, at last, the confrontation with the fallen prince. If we hadn't fought and killed Arthas at the end, bullshit, that would have been a cop-out. It wouldn't have been satisfying, in the same way that Warlords of Draenor wasn't satisfying, because you're fighting the Iron Horde. Oh no, wait, scrap that. No, it didn't work out quite like we'd hoped. Okay, you're fighting the Legion though. Look, oh, Archimon. Nah, piss off. What I'm saying is, if you sell an entire expansion on the faction conflict and on the story of the two leaders and the things they have to do, if everything about your expansion is based around recapturing the very essence of Horde versus Alliance, it's not going to be enough to simply turn around in 8.3 and say, haha, fooled you suckers, it's old god time. We will need some sort of resolution to this war. We can't just go back to business as usual after the way this expansion has been sold, because I think then players really would start to lose interest. They would stop trusting Blizzard when they tell us that the stakes are high. Basically, Blizz would never be able to hype us again, and I know you love hype, Blizz. I love it too. What we really need out of this war is a winner, except we can't possibly have a winner, as we've discussed. So what can we have? Well, the next best thing would be some kind of a seismic shift. If this war really is all that important, then its climax needs to have consequences, and the factions and the world they live in have to be fundamentally changed from when the war started. And I mean more than some important characters dying or some zones changing hands. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I think that something as revolutionary as a third faction is almost the least that the player base will accept. If neither the Horde or Alliance can have final victory over the other, then a fragmenting of those factions into a third option would be an impactful and meaningful enough outcome. But what would that faction be? Well, take my hand, Internet, and allow me to lead you into the darkest corners of pure speculation. This is the fun bit. I've given some reasons as to why I think Blizzard could introduce a third faction, and sticking with narrative for a moment, what would that faction be? Well, this is obviously pure fanfiction territory now, and it's not even the first time we've touched on this subject on the channel. You might remember before BFA was announced that we speculated perhaps at some point in the future we wouldn't have Horde and Alliance at all. Rather, players would be asked to choose between the light and the Shadow, and with maybe some restrictions, could play any race within that choice. We thought that'd be a good way of mixing things up while also keeping the two-faction system that the game is based on. And actually, pretty much everything that's happened in-game since then suggests that a Light and Shadow faction may have been a much better shout than even we thought at the time. But if we're talking about adding a third faction to the game, then I think Blizz would take a different approach. And I think that the most obvious way they would do that would be through Sylvanus. Now, without giving away any major BFA spoilers here, Silvanus has so far been quite problematic in the narrative of this expansion. Ian has talked about there being shades of grey in the actions of both sides in this war, and while there are clearly characters within the Horde who do hold honour and courage and fairness to be paramount, Sylvanas, she doesn't. She clearly doesn't. Her actions so far have been less morally grey, more kill all the things all the time, I love it when the things are killed. And many have called this bad writing on Blizzard's part, but I don't think it is. Sylvanus is acting so objectively badly by every measure that we, the players, hold in our own moralities that I'm convinced it must be intentional from Blizzard. Either to set her up as a villain, which I don't think is the case, or to set her up as a massive and surprising turnaround where she saves the day, which might be the case, or to show us how different she is from the rest of the Horde. And here's the important thing about Sylvanas and her people, the Forsaken. They don't really fit with the rest of the Horde, and they never really have. Sylvanas has one main motivation, the protection of her people and finding ways to maintain her people and create more of her people, a motivation which has seen her at odds with the Horde leadership on many occasions. And you can see this separation in the Horde player base with regards to her actions in Battle of Azeroth. I read dismayed forum posts from Orc players and Tauren players and Troll players lamenting the atrocities their war chief is committing in the name of their faction. Forsaken players, though, they still love her. And I find that incredibly interesting. There's no doubt that Sylvanas is doing what she thinks is right for the survival of the Horde, but what if the Horde don't agree with that kind of survival? Could it be that the climax of this war is Sylvanas doing something so bad, so heinous, so unforgivable, and yet so heartbreakingly justifiable for the survival of the Forsaken, her true people, that she has no choice but to afterwards walk away from the Horde, taking the undead with her and starting that third faction? What if she takes her followers to Northrend, teams up with Blovar, the Lich King, and, oh, I don't know, a new character, someone who might be somehow related to Blovar, and an old character who might also be part of that equation and who is now undead herself, I don't know, whoever really, and begins a new third undead faction. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Taliesin, be honest, you've only based this faction Northrend because you want playable Tuskarr. But no, you're wrong. I mean, it had crossed my mind, obviously, but no, Tuskarr wouldn't be part of the undead faction because they're not undead. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but Taliesin, you appear to be suggesting a faction of purely Forsaken characters. That's not really a faction, is it? That's just the Forsaken. And we've already got that. Well, no, it wouldn't be just Forsaken as we know them now, because right now, every Forsaken you can play is very specifically a human from Lordaeron. Instead, this faction's playable options would be the Forsaken, but also undead versions of races that already exist for the Horde and Alliance. Like how in Divinity Original Sin, you have all of your race options to choose from, but you also have all of those race options again in undead form. It would be cool as hell if you could choose between undead blood elves, gnomes, tauren, trolls, dwarfs, and anything else. Yes, even pandas. I said it, even pandas. They would just be essentially reskins or recolors of existing models. They could even keep the same racials, but there would be a whole faction's worth of soldiers and civilians killed in this stupid, massive, ultimate Horde versus Alliance war of Battle for Azeroth, raised by Sylvanas and the Lich King, and filled with bitterness and resentment towards both of the other sides. Fine, and Tuskarr as well. You bent my arm. Tuskarr can be in there too. You convinced me. Maybe there could be, and I don't know who this could be, obviously, but maybe there's someone who knows a way to create Lightbound Forsaken so that they could be paladins or shaman or druids, so that this new faction could still have access to all of the classes that Horde and Alliance does. So I love the fantasy behind the undead faction, but a big problem with this idea is leveling through old expansions, obviously. Northrend could be phased for low-level players so that its zones were undead leveling areas, but that is a lot of work with all the new quests that you'd have to create, and it certainly doesn't make any sense for an undead faction's players to be playing through Cataclysm content or Legion content or especially Wrath of the Lich King content. And I'm aware that this isn't a great solution, but that stuff doesn't really make sense if you play through it on Horde or Alliance now either. So you start a new character at level 1 and Cataclysm is happening. And then as you level, you jump back in time to Burning Crusade, and then to Wrath, and then you're back in Cataclysm again. If you're doing it as a High Mountain Tauren or a Void Elf, it makes even less sense because your race hasn't been discovered or created yet. So I'm not sure if that's reason enough to rule it out for our imaginary Undead faction either. And then there's the question of splitting the player base. Because why would you want to separate players out even more when obviously an MMO should be doing everything it can to encourage player interaction? And this is a really good point. Queue times for dungeons and battlegrounds would definitely go up. Although on the flip side, world PvP would probably become more frequent simply because now the people that you can fight with are 2/3 of the other players rather than just a half. Or you don't like the Undead faction idea? Well, how about this? How about a faction made up of existing Azerothians who are so disgusted by the carnage and destruction wrought by the Horde and Alliance that they're like, actually, you know what? We need to band together to protect this planet from both of you. Nick on our Patreon page called these guys Azeroth's Defenders, which is a great name, Nick. Really great. We might keep that name, or, you know, we might try and think of a different one, whatever. And it could be made up of existing races, but who belong to neutral factions, like the Earthen Ring, the Cenarian Circle, the Argent Dawn, or the Kirin Tor. So you don't even have to introduce any new races into the game. Although you can if you want, like, I don't know, I can't think of anything, really. And I like this fantasy too. My favourite part of this idea, though, is probably who the faction leaders would be. Because who do we know who are major lore characters connected to those groups and who would be really disillusioned with the Alliance and Horde's constant fighting right now? Well, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, allow me to introduce you to the new leaders of Azeroth's Defenders, Thrall and Khadgar. See, now you like it as well. So what do you think, guys? I know it's a little bit silly, but it comes from a place of feeling that in Battle for Azeroth, something big has to happen to the factions. Something has to justify all this focus on the war. Something has to change. Hey, maybe there will be a winner. Maybe the Alliance will just get wiped out and all of those races will have to join the Horde in one glorious whole. The complete opposite of what we're suggesting here. Or maybe the story will be strong and involving enough so that it feels like the war was important enough for everything in the gameplay to just carry on as it always has. Maybe everything I've just said is complete rubbish, but you know what? As long as it was mildly diverting and entertaining rubbish, I think that's okay. But what do you think? Could you go for a third faction? Do you like the Undead idea, or would you do it differently? Would you like to see something completely different happen as the climax of BFA? And perhaps most importantly of all, how do you think Blizzard can make this faction war, this latest faction war, this biggest faction war of all faction wars, feel like the be-all and end-all? How can they make this matter? Let us know in the comments below. And thanks for joining us today. Genuinely, I feel like I just needed to talk about fun stuff for a bit while we get these guides together, so you being here has helped more than you know. If you enjoyed this little chat, don't thank us. Thank our patrons who give their actual real-life money to make all of our videos happen. And honestly, in this busy time of expansions and weddings, we really couldn't do it without you guys, so thank you. If you didn't like it, downvote the shit out of it. Remember, my name is Wow Chakra. No, my name is Taliesin from me and Evitel. Until next time, which will almost certainly be the weekly reset, cheerio.